I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to find things that I like. And while there's more and more stuff to buy, I find that they don't fit well, or they aren't made well, or the fabrics aren't great quality. So as soon as you wash them, well, they kind of look like. So when I do find things I like, I always wish I bought more of them. And I always seem to realize this at the end of the season when they're completely sold out. But luckily, we can copy our favorite pieces of clothing and recreate them in as many different fabrics and styles as we like. Now, you probably won't be surprised when I tell you designers copy each other, which is, look, it's what happens. But they also use vintage garments for inspiration, and during my pattern cutting career, I've had the privilege to knock off some incredible vintage pieces. Some highlights were this amazing drape dress from Vivienne Westwood. Their pattern making is always amazing. And a really cool jacket from Uni Watanabe, and also some really cool military pieces that designers would get from the Friday markets at Portobello Road. So I've had a lot of experience copying really complex garments, and now I'm going to share all the tips and tricks I've learned along the way and discuss the different methods you can use to clone your favorite piece of clothing accurately. So if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I'm big on accuracy and big on detail. Hey, pattern making's my job, so here's the plan. First things first, I will set you up for success. So before creating this video, I had a look at some of the most popular ones on YouTube, and some of them didn't seem to worry too much about accuracy. Either they wouldn't pin down the clothes or use weights, which means the clothes would move, or they'd add the seam allowances while they were tracing. And the theory behind it seemed to be, well, you can trial and test it later on. I take the opposite approach. The way I see it, copying clothes is like reverse pattern cutting. You already have the answer, so don't risk losing it. Somebody else has done all the hard work for you and made an amazingly well-fitting garment that you like. And fitting is hard, and you're copying this piece of clothing because you like the fit. So don't give yourself unnecessary headaches. Follow these steps, put the love and work in now to avoid wasting time later on. After we set up the piece, I'll show you how to trace it accurately and discuss the different methods you can use. So I actually use all these methods, and often I use a combination of them when I copy clothing. And if you're new to copying clothing, experiment and see what works best for you. But however you decide to do it, make sure you take your time. You need to be able to trust the lines you've traced. Why? Because there are a million different ways to make a pattern. And yes, some are bad, and as you get better at pattern cutting, you'll be able to look and see what looks off, and you'll be able to fix it. But also remember that something looking off or different may actually be innovative. And if you're copying especially high-end designer clothing and you like the fit, maybe you stumbled across some amazing idea and it's the best way to shape a sleeve head ever. Once you've created your pattern outline, I'll show you how to double check your work. Now a confession, and hopefully this won't turn you off, hopefully it will give you comfort more than anything. I actually find tracing quite hard, well, tracing accurately anyway. And as I said, I'm watching all these videos, people just sort of quickly drawing around the outline and be like, oh look, see how easy tracing is? And yeah, tracing around an outline is really easy, but they never seem to show you, especially on complex garments, like even shirts or shorts, if what they've actually drawn is correct. And after I finish tracing and take my piece of clothing off, I will immediately cross-check my measurements. Now, this doesn't take long, and it's a really quick way to show you whether you've done something wrong, and you can fix it right away rather than wasting all of this time toiling. Once you've done that and checked your measurements, you can be pretty confident that your pattern is close to perfect. So that's the plan for this video, and I'm going to start by doing a very detailed demonstration of how to trace the front of this shirt here. And then we're going to go into some more complex garments. When a piece of clothing is flat, and you can lay it flat on paper, it's relatively easy to trace. But how do you trace darts on a dress? Or how do you capture the ease on the top of a fitted sleeve? Or tucks on a sleeve hem? When you can't lay a piece of clothing flat, it becomes a bit more complex. So we're going to go through that. And I'll also just share some of the cautionary tales I've learnt along the way during my career. And I'll show you which pieces you shouldn't be tracing. If that sounds a bit overwhelming, don't worry, we're going to get there. Let's start with the basics. And I love using your own wardrobe as a source of pattern making inspiration. You like it for a reason, right? So use it. And also tracing your own clothing is a great way to learn pattern cutting. So let's get started. Most importantly, you'll need the clothing you want to trace. And make sure you give your clothing a good press to remove any wrinkles or creases. And if your clothing is symmetrical, so like if you've got a shirt, the back yoke here is symmetrical, also the collar. So you can actually just fold it in half and make sure the seams and edges are on top of each other, so it's really in half. And then you can press along the center line here. This will just help you mark your center line, which is really important for tracing, and we'll get to that in a second. Make sure you don't press too hard though. You don't want to ruin your favourite piece of clothing with the crease line.
You also need a pencil and a rubber and enough paper.
If you've watched any of my videos, you know how much I love spot and cross paper. I wouldn't work without it, but any lightweight craft paper or gift wrapping paper will also work.
You also need paper scissors and a ruler.
So preferably a clear, transparent ruler like this one. And if you like using a French curve, you can grab that too. But honestly, if you've drawn, trace the lines correctly, you probably won't need it because you have all the points and you can just connect them drawing freehand.
It's always good to have something to protect your table, like a cutting mat, or thick cardboard works too. And you'll need your tracing tools.
So there are several different ways you can copy clothing, and there are lots of different tools you can use. And these are the two methods I use. So firstly, we have interfacing, and I think it's actually called violin interfacing. When I asked for it on the weekend, I said interfacing and they told me violin interfacing. So I think it's violin interfacing, but I call it interfacing. And you use that with either like a pen or a marker. You can use a vanishing marker if you prefer, if you don't want to risk damaging your clothes. And second method is your chosen paper, so spot and cross or craft paper. And then you can use several different tools. So you can use a pencil, pins, tracing wheel, and I've seen some people use awl. I don't really use the awl, or the drill hole kind of thing. But see, yeah, there's several different options. I'll kind of show you how to use all of them, but once again, you should experiment. And I will mostly be using the second method, so the one with paper and pencil, pin and tracing wheel. That's the one I use the most, and it's best for more basic pieces of clothing, but I will demo the violin method as well, and I'll tell you when I would use it.
Okay, you've got your materials, but before you start, it's important to analyse your clothing. Is it a true fit?
This does not matter for oversized styles, but if your clothing is fitted anywhere on the body, even across the shoulders, maybe even especially across the shoulders and chest, if the fabric has any stretch in it, or even what I like to call give, so it doesn't actually have any stretch in it, like elastine, but it can still give a bit when you pull it, it may mean that the garment's measurements are actually smaller than your body's measurements, which is completely fine. You can still copy it, but when you create your pattern of the copied clothing, make sure you make your sample in the same or similar type of fabric. So if you're copying something for stretch, get a stretch fabric. If you don't do that, you're going to need to resize the pattern. And I'm not going to cover resizing in this video because there's too much to do already. But I just want you to be aware of it because I don't want you to spend all this time tracing this beautiful piece of clothing and then get a different type of fabric and find that it doesn't work. And if a card does pop up, that means I have done the resizing video. It's probably a good one to do, and it's on my list, but hopefully I'll get to do it soon. So before we start tracing, let's talk about things you do not need to trace. And essentially, anything that's a rectangle, you don't need to bother tracing. So on a shirt, that would be the cuffs, the vent band, the cuff placket, some waistbands, so usually the ones on jeans are rectangles. Same for like t-shirt ribbing, that's usually a rectangular pattern, that's always a rectangular pattern. Belts, belt loops, do not bother tracing things that are rectangular. Instead, do this.
Measure the length and the width of the rectangular shape, like I'm doing for this shirt cuff here. And then draw a rectangle that is the same dimensions. Once you have the shape, you can then measure how far the buttons and buttonholes are from the edges and mark them accordingly. If the cuff was contoured, perhaps had a diagonal or rounded edge, I would draw the rectangle and then put the cuff on top and draw around the edge to get the shape. And you can do the same thing for the cuff placket here too. Just draw the rectangle the same dimensions as the shirt. When you're tracing rectangles, make sure you check if the piece is on the fold. If it's on the fold, there won't be a seam along the edge. The fabric will be folded. If there is a seam, so it's not on the fold, perfect. Just add seam allowances to your rectangle and notch key intersection points like the underarm seam of the sleeve and any tucks on the sleeve, and you're good to go. But if it's on the fold, like my shirt cuff, you'll need to reflect the shape to the other side. So just draw the rectangle again and then add the seam allowances. And I'll just add the grain line going across the piece here. See how the stripes are going across the piece? And I'll write fold line along the center line. This is where the fabric will be folded. Then I'll add the key notches, so I'll mark the vent band, the underarm seam, the first and second pleat, and the placket. And I'll mirror those notches along the bottom edge too. There is one catch with ribbing though. Ribbing, like the one on my shirt collar, is actually stretched along the neckline, so the pattern is actually smaller than the neckline measurement. Ribbing patterns are a bit tricky because they depend on the amount of stretch your ribbing has. To copy this shirt, I would measure the top edge of the ribbing, which isn't stretched, and then I would measure the width, then create a rectangle that is this shape. Then, see how the ribbing is on the fold? I would draw another rectangle and write fold line along here. I then add the seam allowances along each edge, and I'll write fold line along the center. Then at the bottom here, I'm going to write how much I need to stretch the ribbing by. So I'll measure the front and back neckline. Then on my pattern, I'll draw an arrowed line and write stretch to 64 centimeters. So the ribbing wasn't stretched that much. The rectangle I drew was 58 centimeters, but each design is different and sub-ribbing is stretched a lot. So that's the pattern, but please check this before you create your sample. Each piece of ribbing is unique, and the one you use may stretch more or less than the one your shirt has, so please check the pattern. If it stretches more, reduce the pattern length. If it stretches less, increase the pattern. An easy way to test this is to cut a piece of ribbing using your current pattern, and then try and stretch it to the neckline length you need. Don't overstretch it, or the neckline will buckle. It should be a light stretch. Okay, so there's some things you don't need to trace, and I started with that to save you time because obviously drawing a rectangle is much easier than tracing. But now, let's get into tracing some clothing. Now I'm going to walk you through how to set up each piece. If you're copying something quite simple, say a t-shirt, some people like to trace the front and back together at the same time. I don't like to do this. I don't find it very accurate, and in a way you still need to make two separate pattern pieces, so I don't think it really saves you any time either. The first thing you need to do is select the piece you want to trace. I'm going to start with the front of my shirt. Then, cut a piece of pattern paper big enough to fit the piece with seams. If your piece is on the fold and you're tracing just one half, make sure you have enough room for both sides. Next, you want to draw the grain line on your paper. But before you just draw a line anywhere on your paper, find the grain line on the piece you're copying. For example, I know the front button placket is always on the grain, and you can also see by the stripes here. So I would draw a long straight line along the edge of my paper, leaving enough room near the edge to draw the full placket, as it's on the fold. Then, once I've drawn the grain line on the paper, I'll line up my front button placket edge with the grain line and pin the shirt in place. This is how I would do the front of a shirt, and I'll show you other examples later. Once I've pinned the grain lines together, I'll smooth the piece out until it's lying nice and flat, and pin it near the corners and along the seams. You can also use weights, and you don't need professional weights, just anything heavy around the house, like this little guy I picked up when I was living in Morocco. But I actually like to pin. I always seem to bump my weights. So I'm just pushing the piece till it's flat, and pinning a little bit back from the seams. You'll see why in a second. Make sure you smooth along the neckline and the armholes. We want these areas to be very accurate. You'll need to get the nearby pieces out of the way too, and it's okay if they're bulky or wrinkled, but the piece you're copying must be flat. If you can't get the entire piece flat, maybe it has a dart or folds, you'll have to do it in sections, and I'll show you how to trace these later in the video. Okay, my front is almost ready to trace. I'm just finishing the top here, and you can see it's kind of turned inside out. That's fine. In fact, it may actually make life easier when I copy my pattern. The back pieces and other pieces can be draping over the front. The only thing that matters is that the piece you're copying is completely flat. And now I'm ready to trace. When you're tracing the piece, you need to trace the seams exactly. And there are a couple of ways you can trace a seam. Firstly, if the edge is exposed, like a hem, you can just trace along it. Easy. And I'm just slightly pulling the fabric towards the hem so that it's taut. Don't stretch it though. And rather than drawing one continuous line, I'm making small, short lines, kind of like long points that I'll connect later on with my ruler. I find this more accurate than trying to draw one continuous line. However, if the seam is sewn to other pieces, you'll need to either trace over the seam with a tracing wheel. This tool is accurate, but I only use it if I don't think it will damage my clothes, so I wouldn't use it on a silk top, or if I'm happy to damage the clothing a bit. And you just use your hand to hold the seam in place, and then draw over the seam with the tracing wheel. You'll need to apply a fair bit of pressure, so make sure you put a cutting mat underneath your paper to protect your table. You can also copy the seam using a pin, and you literally just press into the seam with the pin. This is also very accurate, but the holes are a bit hard to see, so if your eyesight isn't great, this might not be the best option for you. And I'll also put my finger near the seam, say 1 to 1.5 centimeters away, so like half an inch, and peel the nearby pieces up so I can see the seam underneath. Then I'll press my finger towards the seam so the fabric is taut, but not stretched, and draw a line next to the seam. Whichever method you use, make sure you use your fingers to push the seam out a little bit. Don't stretch it, just give it a little tug. Make sure you're focused on getting the corners right though, and they can be really difficult with all the seam bulk, but the corners are critical to the overall shape, so spend some time getting those right. This is where the pin method can be really handy. Once you've traced the edge of your piece, you can mark the details. So the placement of design features like pockets, where the buttons are, holes for drawstring, zips, vents at the side seam, mark anything on the piece. And once you've marked all those, you can remove the clothing from the paper and draw over all your markings with a pencil. Use a ruler to draw all your straight lines, and for the curves, you can either use a French curve to connect the points or just draw freehand. You can also clean up your pattern piece as you go, smooth any bumps, straighten the lines, and check the corners. Most corners meet at 90 degrees, except the shoulder seam around the neck. And you might find that some of your markings are off. That's why it's good to take your time and use a couple of methods, because then you can find their average. You should also get in the habit of marking the center front and center back on your pattern. And you really need to mark the center front on shirts. Why? So on a shirt, the center front is in the middle of the button placket here, and this is where all the buttons must be placed. I didn't mark the button placket when I traced my pattern because I can just measure it, and it's 2.4 centimeters. Then I'll draw a line parallel to the original grain line, which became the front edge of my shirt. And I'm drawing this line dashed because it's a stitch line. All stitch lines should be dashed. So this is my visible front button placket, and in the center, I'll draw a line all the way down. This is my center front. I'm going to mark all the buttons on there. If you forgot to mark the buttons, or you want to check them, just measure the distance on your shirt and then mark the same distance on your pattern. When you mark buttons, draw a dashed circle about the same size as the button and draw a cross in the middle. Then place the circle so the center of the cross is where the button will be sewn. Also, a shirt front button placket is traditionally 2 times the button's diameter. So if you want to keep the same ratio, make sure you get the same size buttons as the piece of clothing you're tracing. Once you've drawn the buttons, you can mark the buttonholes by drawing a horizontal line about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch longer than your button diameter, with short perpendicular lines at each end. And there's usually a 5 millimeter gap between the buttonhole and the start of the button. This leaves enough room for the thread bulk. You can measure your shirt to get the length and buttonhole placement too. So I've finished the visible button placket, but what about the placket underneath? My shirt has a standard front button placket, so it has 2 folded sections. There actually are quite a lot of different ways to finish a front button placket, and you can see all the different types and how to make them in the guide for my oversized shirt kit. When you trace a piece on the fold, whether it's a cuff, waistband, or placket, you won't be able to copy the fabric that has been folded underneath, like along the front button placket here. But I need to include this in my pattern. So I'll just measure the width of the fold and then draw a parallel line that distance away from the placket edge. So this is the section that will be folded under. But there is another folded edge inside here, and I obviously can't see inside, so I need to feel how wide this folded section is. So I'm just feeling for the edge of the fabric, and I can't feel anything, so it must be the same width as the placket. But it's not quite the same width, and this is something you would only know if you're a pattern maker. When we fold something inside or under, we need to make it slightly smaller. Let me explain. So every fabric, even the lightweight ones, have a thickness to them. And when you fuse it and fold it, like on a front button placket, this thickness can really add up. And we need to take this thickness into account when we create our pattern. Take a look at this diagram. See how cramped it is in that corner there? If both these sections were the same width, the fold inside would buckle because it would be crashing into the tight corner here. But if you make it slightly smaller, it will sit really nicely. So for a shirt, I will make the width of the section that folds inside, so this final rectangle here, about 5 millimeters smaller. Then I'll write fold line next to the lines that are folded, and write stitch line next to the line where the placket will be stitched. I'll also just finish off the top and bottom here. The hem is straight all the way across, but at the top I need to match the curves in the neckline. So I'm just marking a point the same height as where the placket will be folded and then connecting the points. So when I fold the placket, actually, I need to trim this edge so I can fold it properly. They have pretty much, actually the shape could be better. So this is why you check your pattern. Now they have the same shape. To mark the pocket, I'm just going to connect my trace lines. You won't be able to see them because I use a tracing wheel, but I'm just connecting them with a ruler. As a guide, the top pocket edge is usually perpendicular to the grain line, so you might want to double check what you've copied. And also I'm just checking the point here is in the middle and then drawing my lines. These lines are actually stitch lines, so they should be dashed, so I'll just rub out some sections. Then I'll put drill holes at each corner so the pocket can be placed accurately. You can either use an actual drill hole to mark the holes, or just draw a circle with a cross in it, which is what I do as it's more accurate. One last thing, the front button placket is usually patch fused to give it extra strength, and to indicate this on my pattern, I'm just drawing really light diagonal lines along the two folded sections closest to the edge and writing fuse on it. Patch fusing just means you cut a piece of fuse big enough for the section and fuse it to your fabric after you cut it. This is different to block fusing. Block fusing is when you fuse the entire pattern piece. Patch fusing is just a small section, and the machinists will usually iron on this piece of fusing when they're sewing the sample. Then label the pattern piece with the name, so in my case I'll write front, then write the cutting instructions. This piece is a pair, so I'll write cut one pair self. If your piece has fusing, so it feels a bit stiff, add plus fuse. Shirt collars, stands, cuffs, waistbands and facings are usually fused. I'll also just draw a grain line, which will be the same direction as the placket. To give you some peace of mind and confidence in what you've traced, it's a good idea to check your pattern. And this technique is what you do if you were checking a sample or production run in the industry, but reversed. So when you send a pattern to get a sample or into production, you send a spec sheet with a rather long list of pattern measurements on it. And these pattern measurements are taken at key locations, so like the armhole, neckline, bust, waist and hip, things like that. And when the sample or production comes back, usually some lucky intern will have the pleasure of measuring all the clothing to make sure it checks those measurements. Now, I'm not saying you have to do all these measurements, but for oversized clothes like this shirt, I definitely measure the armhole, neckline and shoulder length. Sleeves are harder to trace because they have ease and the collar stand seams are a bit bulky, so it's nice to know you have an accurate measurement for where the sleeve and collar stand are attached, so you can check they're the right measurement and work out the ease, but we'll get to that later. And I'll just check my pattern matches the measurement on my shirt and adjust it if I need to. My neckline was 14.2 centimeters on my shirt and my pattern is 14 centimeters. So I'm just going to scoop it a bit more to get that extra length, and I'll also write the measurement on my pattern. This will come in handy when I create the sleeve and collar stand later. And I'll check the shoulder seam length. My shirt is 21 centimeters and my pattern is a bit shorter, so I'll mark 21 centimeters on the line and then just redraw the armhole. This is actually looking really good because I can make the corner more of a 90-degree angle. Last, I'll check the armhole. My shirt is, let's get rid of the bulk underneath and measure it properly. Okay, it's 23.5 centimeters and my pattern is 23 centimeters. Okay, something is off. And to be honest, I'm not loving the shape of my armhole, especially at the bottom here. So I'll lie my shirt flat and position the pattern on top so the side seam and shoulder are aligned. And see, my armhole is way too high. So let's redraw it. And when I measure it, the armhole is 23.5 centimeters and it's looking good. Okay, so now you know how to set up your piece, how to trace it using different tools, and how to check your pattern. And you can see how important checking your pattern is. Part of me really wanted to just sort of turn the camera off and fix my pattern behind closed doors and see, look how close it is to being right. But I think it's really important for you to see that tracing alone will rarely get you accurate results. And it's not your fault or like my fault, it's just that particularly corners, they're really pokey and hard to get into and the seams have bulk. So it's good to get into a practice of checking your pattern. So measure your clothing, check and match the pattern, and if something's looking off, like the measurements aren't matching up, lay your pattern over the clothing. And before we get into some more difficult pieces like sleeves with ease and tucks, let me quickly show you how to trace pieces that are symmetrical and pieces that are symmetrical with box pleats, which are a bit more tricky. Let's start with the back yoke. Cut a piece of pattern paper big enough to draw the piece and draw a line down the center. This will be the fold line of the yoke. Now let's find the center of the yoke on the shirt by folding the piece in half. Make sure the seams are on top of each other. Then you can either pin the layers together or use a weight. And it's a bit tricky to line all the seams up, so I'm just going to pin and put it through the corners to get myself started. This is a bit time consuming, but it's important to get it accurate. And I'm just feeling for the seams and then pinning them together when they're on top of each other. Okay, I'm done. Once you've got all the seams on top of each other, either press the center line with an iron or put pins vertically along the center line. Then I'll unfold the fabric and put the center line on top of the line I've drawn on my paper and pin it in place. I don't like to trace things on the fold. The layers can become quite bulky and you'll lose some of the width. It also makes it hard to trace or pin through seams when you have lots of layers. And you know what would have been a quicker way to find the center line? The center is at the middle of the box pleat, so I have my point at the bottom here, and I could have found the center line at the top by measuring the neckline and dividing it in half to find the center. So if your piece's center line or fold line is short, you can do this. Then smooth the fabric till the piece is flat and pin near the seams and corners. Then use a tracing wheel, pin, or pencil to copy the seams. Remember to pay special attention to the corners too. While I'm tracing away here, I'll share a bit of a cautionary tale on yokes. Yokes on shirts actually have some shaping below the bottom corner. It's very subtle, just a small wedge has been removed from the top of the back here. This means that while the seam at the bottom of the yoke may look like it's a sty line, it actually has some shaping. The same thing happens on fitted trousers, like jeans. All fitted trousers need a dart in the back to create the curves for your bum. But when you add a yoke, it becomes a separate pattern piece and you can close that dart so it isn't visible anymore. But you should never close a big dart like this one, otherwise this will happen. So what I would do is split the dart into 2 smaller darts, then close it. Don't overthink this, just measure the distance between the dart legs and divide it by 2. Then use that measurement to draw 2 smaller darts that finish at the same length as the original dart. You'll still have to reshape the surrounding seams, so you just blend around the points to create a nice smooth line, but it looks much better than closing one dart. Okay, so it may seem like I've gone really off topic, but firstly, I want to show you some advanced pattern cutting stuff so you actually understand what you're tracing. Secondly, I'm telling you all this so that you believe me when I recommend that when you're tracing a piece that you stop at the seams. And this is because you didn't make the pattern, neither did I, so we have no idea if it's a style line or if it's actually a fit line. And it's better to be safe than sorry. So when you're copying a piece, make sure you stop at the seams. For example, if you had got that pair of jeans and decided to copy the back pant with the yoke, you would have missed out on all that shaping. And yet you still have a pattern, but it wouldn't be the same as your clothing and actually wouldn't fit you very well. So better be safe than sorry, stop at the seams. Now that I've traced over my seams, I can remove the shirt and draw over the lines. Before I completely remove the shirt, I'm just going to measure the center back length. I was a bit worried with the bulk of the box plate that I wasn't getting this measurement right, and it's 12.7 centimeters. And when I mark that point on my center back, you can see it's way below the point I marked. But it's actually in line with the other points I marked, which is correct. See how the stripe is straight here? That means the seam is straight. Actually, look at this little bump here. Something's gone wrong with the sewing, which I'm sure wasn't helping my tracing. You kind of need to become an investigator. Look for clues to help you with your tracing. And now that I'm reflecting back on what I've done, it was actually a much easier way for me to trace this back yoke pattern. So my yoke, not all yokes, but my yoke, the bottom seam was straight. How do I know that? I can look at the stripes. So what I really could have done is just drawn a horizontal line on the paper and then place the back yoke bottom seam on it and then trace the pattern. Easy. So I do put a lot of effort into planning these videos, but even while doing this demonstration, I discovered 2 much easier ways to find the center line of my back yoke on my shirt. So firstly, I could have measured the back neckline, divide in half to find the center, and then measured the bottom seam, divide in half to find the center, and that would be my center line. Or even easier than that, I could have taken a second just to look at my back yoke and seen, look, the stripes are going directly across the bottom. That must mean the bottom seam is completely straight. I could have just drawn a line on paper and put the bottom seam on there and then traced around it. Would have been so much easier. So do as I say, not as I do, and I should do this as well. Just take your time, analyze the piece first, and just think about
is there an easy way to find the center line, or to find a line that is completely straight and on grain, and then they can use that to trace your pattern.
Now I'll just draw over my lines and use my ruler to make sure all the straight lines are nice and straight. The center fold line here will become my center back. The pattern is usually perpendicular at the center back, so make sure these lines meet just briefly at a right angle. Once I've drawn the outline, I'll measure the neckline, armhole and shoulder seam on my shirt and check it's the same as the pattern. My shoulder seam was a little bit short, so I'm just lying the pattern on top of the shirt again and just checking what went wrong. And you can see in the corner here, I need to extend it a bit. I'll also measure the distance of the box pleat fold from the center line and add a notch here. Now that I've done the front and back yoke patterns, I can true my shoulder seam by lying the back yoke pattern over the front. And I'll need to flip the pattern to the other side so I can line up my neckline, so sorry you can't see everything. But you can see they're the same length, which I expected, as I already checked the measurements. All seams should have at least one notch on them, so I'll just draw one here on the front and then draw a matching one on the back yoke.
Just a really quick note on front and back shoulder seams. They're not usually at the same angle, however they are usually straight. Just something to keep in mind when you're checking your pattern.
One side of my back yoke is now complete. To complete the pattern, I'll trace it over to the other side by folding the paper along the fold line and tracing over the lines of the tracing wheel. I'll just grab my cutting mat so I don't damage my table. Once the lines are traced, I'll draw over the traced lines with a pencil.
In the industry, you cannot have patterns on the fold. Why? Because someone might not read the fold text or the arrows, or they might not get printed, and they just cut the pattern piece as it is, which would be a disaster in production. So I tell my fashion students to always put their patterns on the fold, but I'm not there watching you, so you do what works for you.
Then I'll label the pattern back yoke and write cutting instructions cut one pair self, because the yoke is self-faced, so it has an inner and outer yoke to give it extra strength. Then I'll draw the grain line. See how the stripes are going in a different direction on the yoke? The grain lines on shirt yokes usually go horizontally across the piece rather than vertically. Why?
Woven fabrics are made of warped and weft yarns, and the warped yarn is the long one that runs vertically along a roll of fabric, and the weft one is the one that runs horizontally across the fabric. And the warp one, so the one that runs long and vertically, is usually stronger. And we want the back yoke to be really strong across the shoulders here. So we cut the pattern so the warp yarn runs across the shoulders. And it's actually the same for the cuff. When you look at cuffs, and you'll notice it on striped fabrics, the warp runs across the cuff, so it has extra strength across that wrist area there.
So I'll just draw the grain line going across the pattern piece and write centre back at the top of the centre line to indicate it's a centre back.
Now let's have a look at the back piece.
It would be pretty easy to copy the back if it wasn't for this box pleat, so I'm just going to close it. If you look inside my shirt, you can see the box pleat folds meet at the centre line. So I need to find the centre line of my back piece, which I can do quite easily with the striped shirt because I can just measure or feel the centre of the box pleat and then pin down whichever stripe runs down at that point. But if my shirt wasn't striped, I would need to find the centre line using the same method I did for the yoke. So pin the side seams together and the underarm, then smooth the fabric till it sits flat, then pin along the centre. Once I've found the centre line, and I can see from my stripes I've got it right, then I need to measure the folded length of the pleat, which I can do by putting my ruler in the fold at the top here and measuring the distance, which is 2 centimetres. I then need to double it because the fold is double backed on itself, and the double distance is 4 centimetres. Then I'll unfold the shirt and I'll measure 4 centimetres out from the centre line and put some pins along the line to mark it. Once I'm done, I should have my centre line pin and a line 4 centimetres away. Then I'll fold the fabric so the new line of pins is under my centre line. Then I'll pin the fold in place. See how I've extended the box pleat from the top to the hem? Essentially, I've closed the box pleat, so now I'm ready to trace the back. Now I'll grab a piece of pattern paper big enough for both sides of the back, and a bit of extra width as I'll need to add the box pleat on both sides of the back. I'll then draw a line near the centre. I need to have enough room to add my box pleat so the line is just in from the centre. Then I'll place the centre line over the line I just drew on my paper and pin it in place. I'll then smooth out the shirt till it lies flat and pin it near the seams and corners. Then I'll trace, pin or draw my seams and hem, And you can see I haven't ironed my hem very well. So I'm just unfolding and pulling it a bit as I go. For the seam near the back yoke, I'm rolling back the fabric, giving the seam a little tug, and folding back the French seam so I can see where the seam is. Same for the armhole. Once I've copied these lines, I'll remove the shirt and draw over the lines. You can see at the top here, the seam connected to the back yoke is curved to create that shaping we talked about earlier. Before I add the box pleat, I'll quickly check my lines. The back yoke seam is 25 centimeters on my shirt. And yes, it's 25 centimeters on my pattern. The armhole is 16.8 centimeters. And my pattern is 17 centimeters, so pretty close. Let's check the side seam. And rather than measuring it, I'm just lining my shirt up against the line. The pattern is a bit shorter, so I'm just going to make it a bit higher at the top and longer at the bottom. By moving the armhole up a couple of millimeters, it will make my armhole smaller too, so the pattern matches the shirt perfectly. Now let's add the box pleat. To do this, I need to add extra width to the length of the fold. The fold length, which I measured and doubled earlier, was 4 centimeters, and I'll draw a parallel line that distance from the center line. Then, I'll blend the top seam and bottom hem to this line, and the line should be completely horizontal, and mark the start of the box pleat, which is 2 centimeters from my center line, with a notch. Then I'll mark the section which will be folded under, which is the folded length, i.e. 4 centimeters, and I'll mark that with a notch too. Then, I'll draw an arrow between the two notches. The arrow should point to where the folded fabric is going, and write fold next to it. And now I have my box pleat. So because I added the folded length to the box pleat, this line isn't the center line anymore. It's actually this line. So I'll rub this line out and make this one my center line and grain line. And if I true the seam with the back yoke pattern, and if I fold the back yoke pattern, you can see this a lot better. You'll see the seams match exactly. I've already got a notch at the box pleat, but I'll also add another one along the seam, then draw the same notch on the back. I can also true my side seam by lying my front pattern over the back, and it's pretty close. However, I've noticed the front hem side seam isn't at a right angle, so I'll make it a right angle, and then mark where it's finishing on the back. And yeah, it's a fair bit lower, so I'll just redraw the hem. And I could freehand, but let's get the original. So I'll just lie the back over the pattern, try line everything up, and then trace around the shape. Once I know the seams match perfectly, I'll add a notch somewhere on the front side seam and draw a matching one on the back. To create the other side of the back, I'll just fold the pattern along the center line and trace all the lines and notches to the other side, so I have both sides of my back pattern. So once you've trued your seams, you can then add your seam allowances. And seam allowances are usually 1 centimeter if you're metric, and 1/2 inch if you're imperial. However, if your shirt has a double row of top stitching, like this one, it probably has a flat felled seam, and you'll need a bigger seam allowance to create the side seam. So 1.5 centimeters for metric, and 5/8 of an inch for imperial users. And just a really quick note on collars here. The thing I want to focus on is the difference between the outer collar, which is on top, and the inner collar, which is underneath. The outer collar is 4 millimeters bigger than the collar underneath. This is so the seam sits nicely when it's sewn. I've done a whole video on this, and I'll put a link to it in the description. You use the same method as the back yoke to find the center line. So just fold the collar in half, and then pin along the center line. Then grab your paper, draw a line down the center, and unfold the shirt, and lay the center line of the collar on top of the line. Then trace around the edges, which is fairly easy. Then lift up the shirt to find the seam. Whoops, that was the stand seam. Let's pull it up some more. Okay, so I've got the outline. Now the seam that connects to the collar stand will stay the same, so I'll just draw over my trace lines. But when I create the outer collar, I want to bring this line out by 2 millimeters, or 1/8 of an inch. Why 2 millimeters and not 4 millimeters? Because when you trace the shirt, you're getting this sewn edge, and when the 4 millimeter extension is folded over, it's halved. And at the point, I'll bring it out 2 millimeters and then bring it back to 0 at the collar stand seam. To create the inner collar, you'll need to trace the same piece again, but bring this edge and point in by 4 millimeters, so it's smaller. And remember, see how the stripes are going across the collar here? That is the direction of the grain line on the collar and the collar stand. So draw the grain line going across the pattern piece. Okay, so now you know how to find the center line and trace relatively easy pieces, so ones that don't have any shaping. And I've also shown you how to check your pattern, true the joining seams, and add the correct seam allowances. So you're ready for a challenge.
Next, I'm going to show you how to add ease to a sleeve, do sleeves with tucks, and we'll also look at pieces with elastics, darts, and last we'll do the interfacing method.
Let's tackle the sleeve. So when you trace a sleeve, you need to fold it in half to find the center line. The underarm seams are symmetrical 99.9% of the time, so flatten the sleeve around the seam so the seam is on the edge and pin it in place. Then smooth the sleeve so it lays flat and pin it in place. You need to be careful of the sleeve head here. The underarm seam has stopped, so you don't really have a guide for the center line. So see how I'm smoothing up from the top of the underarm seam to find the center line? Now you've got the center line. Don't worry if the center line doesn't match the shoulder seam, it doesn't have to. Then I've cut a piece of pattern paper big enough for both sides and draw a line down the center. This will be the center line and the grain line of my sleeve. Then place the center line of the sleeve next to the grain line center line on your paper and pin it in place. Start with the lower half of the sleeve. Now this is really important. Don't force the top of your sleeve head onto the center line. Especially if your sleeve is fitted, it should be pulling away from the center line. Why?
Ease. So if your sleeve is sitting away from the center line at the top here, it just means it has ease, which is actually great. You want your sleeve to be sort of sculpting around the top of the shoulder here. You actually need it, especially if your design is fitted.
So leave the top as it is. Now you can trace around the seams. Drawing the underarm seam and hem is easy. I simply draw around the edge of the pencil, making sure I double check the corners are correct. To do the head, I'm just going to place my finger near the seam and peel up the fabric to reveal the seam underneath and trace along it, taking it very slowly so my line is really accurate. Make sure you draw a notch at the shoulder seam too. Now I've almost done this side, but I've got a gap here. I'm just going to draw around it for now. Then I'll remove the sleeve and pin it to the other side of the sleeve cap.
Front and back sleeve heads are different. Well, they should be anyway. Unless your clothing is really oversized, like a really oversized t-shirt or sweatshirt, then they can be similar-ish. I personally think they should always be different. And I've done a really detailed sleeve drafting video. If you're interested in pattern making or making your own sleeves, you should definitely check it out. And also if your clothing, you like the fit but the sleeve's still a bit off, maybe there are some drag lines or it's feeling tight, this video also has really great fitting tips to help you perfect your sleeve head.
Some people trace both the front and back sleeve head at the same time. I find it more accurate to do them separately, but it's up to you. It's a bit fiddly to reposition the sleeve, however I do have some tricks. Before I do the other side, I draw a perpendicular line across the pattern at the underarm point. This will help me reposition my sleeve. Now I'll flip the sleeve and reposition it so the underarm and the hem line up with the underarm line and the hem line, and then I'll pin it in place. Then just lift up the fabric and trace the other sleeve head. I'm not going to bother doing the underarm seam and hem on this side because the underarm seam and hem should be symmetrical. And once I draw the underarm seam and hem and finalize their shape on the first side, I'll just fold the paper and trace over the lines to copy it to the other side. Now for the sleeve head, I'm just going to draw over my lines and make them look a bit nicer by smoothing out any bumps. Then I'll draw the underarm seam, just smoothing out any bumpy lines. I know the hem should be straight because it was a large hem, so I'll just find the average and draw a straight line across the bottom. Then I'll put a notch along the underarm seam, about halfway, so it's where the elbow would be. Then I'll fold the pattern in half and copy the underarm seam to the other side. And I'm going to mark the front with an F and the back with a B, so don't forget. So back to the sleeve head, I need to work out this ease situation at the top here. And to do that, I need to work out how much ease I have first. This is also a good way to check the sleeve. So I'll grab my front and back pattern pieces. I didn't copy these. This dress is 12 my 1 dart fitted dress block, so I already have the patterns. Then I'll measure all the notches on my armhole and mark the same distance on my sleeve pattern. And I'll do that for the front and the back. So these notches are where the front and back armholes are finishing, and the gap is how much ease I have, and I have 1.5 centimeters of ease. I thought I might have more, so let's do a little test to see how accurate my tracing was. I have the original pattern I used to create my toile here, and I'll just lay it underneath, so you can see the difference. Okay, so my sleeve shape is looking okay, but it should be a bit wider. See how the underarm seams aren't in the same location? Actually, it's probably a bit hard to see on camera, so maybe I'll pin it together and hold it up. Actually, I'll just sketch where the line should be. If I move the underarm seam lines out and increase the width, I'll get the extra ease I'm after too. so that's why I don't have as much ease as I expected, but it's not a disaster. The lower half of the back sleeve head needs to come out a bit too, but the top is okay, and the front is looking pretty good. And if I look at the underarm seam, the elbow width is perfect, but the hem is actually a bit bigger than the original pattern. It's not looking too bad really, so let's keep going. Next step is to draw in the rest of the sleeve over the gap here by blending the lines to create a nice shape. And I need to move the shoulder notch, which was marked as being over here. Ease is gradually eased into the top third of your armhole. So now I need to move the shoulder notch, so it's pretty much in the center of the ease. As a guide, I'd say the amount of ease in the front and back sleeve should be about the same, but I'd often do a couple more millimeters on the front, but it's about half. So I'll divide my ease in half, and then just put the shoulder notch in the middle, and my sleeve outline is done. All I need to do now is add the seam allowances. So if you're a bit worried about tracing sleeves, I know sleeves can be a bit scary in general, just remember that you can always fit your pattern when you sew the toile, and even your final sample, you can still add some on from the sleeve seams or take some off. There are opportunities to fit and adjust your sleeve, and as I said, I've done a video very detailed on how to draft and fit sleeves, so check that out. And remember that before we start getting into doing tucks on sleeve hems, this video is going to do some advanced stuff, but you'll be much better at copying for it, and I haven't seen really any videos talk about ease and sleeve heads, and it is there. And if you're tracing something off and don't know to look out for the ease, you're just going to ignore it. So when you make your pattern, and then when you make your sample with your new pattern, it's not going to be accurate, and you're going to be wondering why. And now you know it's ease, and now you know how to add it back in. Cuffs. I find cuffs a bit fiddly, and I remember when I was starting out, they used to blow my mind. And even when I'm a bit tired now, often when I'm doing a cuff, there's so many measurements and that sort of thing, so I can get a bit brain dead too. So I'm right here with you, which is why when I made my pattern kits, which have a block and a guide in it, I actually, rather than give a basic block, my shirt blocks have a vent band, placket, 2 tucks in there, so that the sleeve is actually kind of finished, just to make it a bit easier for you guys. But anyway, in this demonstration, we are going to trace a sleeve with 2 cuffs at the hem. So to do this, we're going to chop half the sleeve. We use the same technique and method as before with the other sleeve, but at the bottom, essentially, we're going to rebuild it. Before finding the center line of my sleeve, I'll just close the cuff. This will help it keep its shape and lie flat. Then I'll pin along the underarm seam so the seam is on the edge. I'm starting at the underarm and smoothing the sleeve out to find the center line, and I'll continue pinning down the sleeve. And I'm going to stop finding the center line when the tucks start. I can't trace a section of the sleeve accurately because of the tucks, so I don't need to find the center line. Then I'll grab a piece of pattern paper big enough for both sides and draw a line down the center. This is my grain line and the center line. Then I'll line the center line of my sleeve up next to the grain line on the paper. The sleeve will definitely curve away from the center line at the bottom because of the tucks, and if it has a bit of ease on the sleeve head, it'll curve away at the top a bit too. You can see that I can only really pin this middle section here to the center line. The rest curves away. I just need to pin it in the place that it wants to sit. Once the shirt is pinned down, you can trace along the underarm seam, and then you can use a tracing wheel, pin, or lift up the cuff to draw along the sleeve hem. Don't worry about marking all the pleat placements and vent openings yet. They will change when we add the fold length for each pleat. Then, copy the sleeve head using a pencil, pin, or tracing wheel. On more basic fitted sleeves, I like to flip the sleeve to do the other side of the sleeve head. However, because this sleeve has lots of pleats and bulk, I'm worried I might not be able to reposition it accurately, so I'm going to mark both sides on the same side. So I'll mark the shoulder notch and then pull the fabric up so I can draw along next to the seam. Then I'll use a tracing wheel to trace the visible sleeve head on top, and I'll grab a cutting mat to protect my table. You need to press pretty hard to get through all the layers of fabric. So both the front and back sleeve head will be on the same side, and make sure you mark the back yoke seam with a notch too. And you can see I've got the tiniest bit of ease here, which is correct for an oversized shirt. Once you've marked all the seams, you can remove your sleeve. And I'm not going to focus too much on the sleeve head, because I've already done a demonstration on ease, so let's quickly smooth out the underarm seam and look at the hem. We need to know what point we're going to blend the sleeve hem to on the center line, so we need to find out the center line length of your sleeve. An easy way to find the center sleeve length is to actually measure your shirt. So I'll grab my measuring tape and just measure the length at the center, and then I'll measure this length and mark it on my pattern. The point I've marked is below the line that I've drawn in the underarm seam. I know from experience that the hemline of a sleeve should be pretty much straight, so let's check my underarm seam length is correct. And I'll do that by just lining up the shirt with my pattern. And yes, the pattern is a bit short, so I'll mark the correct point, and look at that. These 2 points create a straight line. See how important it is to check your pattern? Now I'll connect the points to create the hem. So we've got the hem shape, but we need to check the length and then mark all the tucks and vents on it. It's really unlikely the sleeve hem length you've copied will be correct, so you need to measure your shirt to check it. So I'm going to measure the sleeve hem. I don't want to include the vent placket or band because they're separate pattern pieces. Just measure the hem, and then you need to include the folded length of each pleat. And while I measure the cuff, I'm just going to draw a diagram here of what the cuff looks like. I'll start from the underarm seam and measure the distance to the vent, so where the vent band starts, and write it down. Then I'll measure how far the pleat is from the sleeve placket. Then I'll measure the folded length of the pleat, and it's 1.5 centimeters. I need to double this measurement because the pleat is always folded back on itself, so it'll be 3 centimeters. Then I'll measure the distance between this pleat and the next pleat, and write it down. And I'll just draw a little arrow between the 2 points of the first pleat to remember it's a pleat. After marking the distance between the 2 pleats, I'll then measure the folded length of the second pleat, and write it down. And I'll draw another arrow just to remember this is the folded length of my second pleat. Then I'll measure the distance from the second pleat edge to the side seam. So that's my sleeve hem, and I have a nice diagram of how long each section is so I can recreate the sleeve hem accurately. And I can also add up all the measurements to get my total hem length, which is 27.7 centimeters. But we need one more measurement to work out the sleeve hem length. So the vent, which is in the center of the back sleeve here at the hem, has a vent band and a cuff placket sewn to it. To attach 2 pieces together, you always need a seam, and you can see how the vent band and placket are attached to the vent here. If you're a metric user, you'll add 1 centimeter, so 0.5 centimeters to each side of the vent band. If you're imperial, you'll add 1/4 of an inch to both sides, so that's 1/2 an inch to your measurements. So just to recap, your sleeve hem length should include the visible hem length that you can measure on your shirt, plus the folded length of each pleat, and the vent seam allowance. Now I'll divide my sleeve hem length by 2, so I'm just doing half of the sleeve here, and I'll measure that distance along the curve of the hem. And you may need to adjust the underarm seam at the point here. My hem is less, so I'll actually bring the underarm seam in a bit. But you might need to bring the underarm seam out. I'll just redraw the seam at the bottom here, and then connect it to the top. Once I'm happy with the sleeve shape, I'll fold my paper in half along the center line, and copy the sleeve hem and underarm seam to the other side. Now I have my full hem, and I can mark the vents and pleats. The sleeve vent should always be on the back of the sleeve, and the pleats should fold towards the vent. I've already got my diagram here, so let's refer to that while I'm marking my sleeve hem. Starting in the underarm seam, first measurement is 6.8 centimeters, so I'll measure and mark that. Now comes the vent, so I'll add the 1 centimeter seam allowance we talked about. Then I'll continue referring to my diagram, so I'll mark the end of the first pleat, which is 2.4 centimeters away, then mark the fold length, and draw an arrow between the 2 points. Then I'll do the next distance, then add the second fold, and add an arrow and write fold next to it. Then let's just check the final measurements match up, and it doesn't. It's a couple of millimeters too small, and my fold length is looking a bit big actually, so let's check that. And yeah, my folded length was too big, so I'll adjust that notch, and the final measurement is now correct. I'll just draw a quick little F and B at the bottom at the hem here, so I can remember which side is the back and the front. The last step is to add the vent height, so I'll measure my shirt, and it's 10 centimeters, and then I'll draw a perpendicular line 10 centimeters long. Now I need to draw its width, which is the 1 centimeter seam allowance we talked about. So I'm drawing a parallel line 1 centimeter away from the original line. If you're imperial, make this line 1/2 an inch away. In the center, I'll draw my wide cut line. The vent opening is in the center of the seam allowance, and the wide cut line is the line you'll cut along so you can add the vent band and placket. The sleeve placket here is stitched above the vent opening, so I'm just placing the shirt on top of my pattern so I can draw the shape of the top of the sleeve placket. So I've got the height, but I'm just going to grab my ruler so those lines are nice and straight. Then I'll measure the width and add it to my pattern. At each corner, I'll add a drill hole, with just a small circle with a cross in the middle. I'll also add drill holes to the top of my wide cut line so you know which points to cut to. And I'll write wide cut line along the center. My hem is now done. The last thing I would need to do is copy the lines I traced for the front sleeve head over to the other side, which I can do by just folding my paper in half and tracing the lines with the tracing wheel. Then just add your seam allowances.
So that was a big one, and my brain's hurting a bit too. I promise darts are easier, and before we get into darts, I'll quickly show you elastics.
Usually, elastic bands are in rectangular shaped patterns, like the waistband on these shorts here. And you can see there are 3 stitch lines and the elastic is in the center. This elastic waistband is a bit more complex than the average elastic, and I'm going to show you how to capture and mark all these lines on the pattern, but every design is different, so spend some time analyzing your piece first. To create the waistband pattern, stretch the elastic and measure the length along the waistband. I measure in sections rather than doing the whole thing at once, so I'd measure from the side seam here to the center front seam. Take your time getting this measurement right. It's really important, and you can use it again to check the front pattern waist length too when you copy it. Then I'll do the back. This is my center back and side seam, and I'm placing the measuring tape at the center back and then pulling the elastic. See how I'm kind of doing it in sections? It can be easier and more accurate to just pull a small section, place your finger at the end to hold the measuring tape and fabric in place, and then do the next section. Now I've got my measurements. I only measured half because my shorts are symmetrical, so I can just double the measurements to get my entire waistband length. Now I'll get those measurements and start drawing the rectangle for my waistband. I'm just going to do a small section, otherwise it'll go way off the camera screen, but you should use the full length of your waistband to draw the rectangle. Half my shorts, so from the center front to the center back, was 52.5 centimeters in total, so I will double that, which is 105 centimeters. So I will draw a line that is 105 centimeters long. Then I'll measure the total width of my waistband, which is 5 centimeters, and I'll draw the width of the rectangle, so I'm just drawing a line parallel 5 centimeters away. Now I need to measure the stitch lines on the waistband, which are 1.5, 2 centimeters, and 1.5 centimeters apart. And I'll mark these on my pattern using a dash line, which means stitch line, and put drill holes every 6 to 8 centimeters. And you should draw these stitch lines and drill holes all the way along the waistband. Most rectangular shaped patterns, like waistbands, will be on the fold. This makes the pattern quicker and to cut and sew. So check if your waistband is on the fold, and if it is, like mine, you'll need to create the other side. So I'm drawing another parallel line 5 centimeters away, which was the width of my waistband, and make sure you write fold line next to the first 5 centimeter line, which is now in the center of your pattern. And then you can add your seam allowances. To finish the pattern, I need to add some sewing instructions for the elastic. So I'm writing insert X centimeter elastic into the middle section here where the elastic is. Then I'll draw an arrowed line through the center all the way across the pattern on both sides.
So how long the elastic is depends on how stretchy the elastic is. So the best way to work this out is to get your chosen elastic and stretch it to see how much you need for your chosen length. So the length I need is for the waistband, so it's 105 centimeters. So I get my elastic and say it's fairly stretchy, I stretch it and I find that I need 70 centimeters to reach 105 centimeters. So then I'd write insert 70 centimeter elastic into on my pattern.
You also need to think about the elastic width. The section where my elastic is inserted is 2 centimeters wide. So I want a piece of elastic that is slightly smaller, say 1.5 to 1.8 centimeters wide. Even lightweight fabrics get bulky when they're gathered together with an elastic, so you need to leave a bit of room for the fabric bulk so the elastic can sit nicely and not buckle. Also, don't forget to put a notch at the side seam, center front and center back on your waistband so you can match the seams on the piece correctly. Now, to do the surrounding pieces, they aren't rectangles, especially these shorts here. Maybe an elastic skirt might be a rectangle, so you could try pulling the elastic and seeing if it looks rectangular and then measuring it, but these shorts definitely aren't. So what do?
You'll need somebody to stretch and hold the elastic out for you. I find weights don't secure enough, and if you try and pin it to the paper, it'll just crumple the paper. So get a friend or a family member to help you, it'll make it so much quicker. Now let's tackle darts. And I've seen some videos where people have completely ignored that their clothing is darts, and you can't ignore darts, especially bust darts and the darts that come down from the waist because they make room for your bum. So I'm going to show you how to trace a relatively simple triangular dart at the bust, and I'll be copying one of my favourite pieces of clothing, which is this bias cut top here, which I made the pattern for a designer about over a decade ago now.
For a simple triangular bust dart, like the one on this top, I'd use the paper and pencil pin or tracing wheel method. So I just find my center line by folding the piece in half so the seams are on top of each other. And the top is a bit fiddly because it's on the bias, plus the fabric is quite slippery and thick, so the seams are a bit bulky. Anyway, when I have my center line, I'll put some pins along it. See how I'm sort of holding the side seam here and then smoothing out from it? I have to be very careful because my fabric is slipping and moving around quite a lot. So I'm checking the side seam and then lightly pulling the fabric out towards the center to find the center line. So I wouldn't usually do this, but I'm actually going to trace my top on the fold. My fabric is just really slippery and it's on the bias, so it's moving around a lot. So I'm worried if I unfold it, I won't be able to get a very accurate reading. So I wouldn't usually do it, but this time I'm doing it on the fold. Now, I'll grab a piece of pattern paper big enough for the whole front of the top and draw a line down the center. This is going to be my center line, and it would usually be the grain line, but I'm doing a bias top, so I'd actually draw a different grain line, but usually it'd be the center line and your grain line. Then I'll pin the center line on my top on top of the center line of my pattern. The important thing to remember about copying clothes using the paper method is your piece of clothing needs to be flat. When you aren't able to get it flat anymore, stop. So I'm just pinning along the center line till about the bust dart. The bust dart is creating all the shaping and curving on the clothing, so I can't get it flat. So I stop here on the center line, but then I can pin the rest of the top below the bust dart to the paper. I can get this whole section flat. Then I'll fold the back of the top over to reveal the side seam here. I'm just pulling the fabric lightly so it's taut and drawing next to the seam. And I'll stop at the dart here. Then I'll draw along the hem and put a notch at the top of the slit here. Then I'll pull back the fabric and mark the dart point, so where the dart is finishing, and draw along the dart leg. Then I'm going to unpin my top so I can get inside and measure the width of the dart at the seam, so how wide it is, and it's 1.3 centimeters. This is just half the measurement though, because the dart is folded in half, so I need to double the measurement, which is 2.6 centimeters. And I'll measure this distance and mark a point 2.6 centimeters away from the dart leg I drew. This point will become the other side of my dart. Then I'll unpin the lower section so I can rotate the piece and copy the top half. And I'm going to put a pin at the bust point here. Bust point, not dart point. The bust point is usually 2 centimeters away, so 3/4 of an inch from the dart point. I don't want this point to move, because essentially I'm rotating the piece around this bust point. Then I'll unpin the rest of the bottom section and rotate the piece. When I rotate it, I need to make sure the dart is now touching the mark I drew on my paper, which was 2.6 centimeters away. This will ensure that the dart is the correct size. Then I'll pin along the armhole and neckline, making sure the piece is nice and flat at the top, and I'm pinning just slightly back from the bound edge. Before I copy the top half, I'll just double check the dart is lined up correctly, and it is. Then I'll fold back the lace and draw along the neckline, and I'll spend a bit of time making sure I get this intersection right. Then I'll carefully pull back the binding and draw along the armhole. Then I'll draw the rest of my side seam. Then I'll remove my top and use my ruler to draw the dart legs, which are both straight. And I'll use my ruler again to create a nice smooth neckline here. But I'm going to draw the armhole freehand. You could use a French curve if you want to. Then I'll use my ruler again to smooth out the side seam here and make sure this notch marking the top of my slit is really clear. Now, I just need to check my dart legs are the same length, which I'll do by folding my paper along the dart and checking the side seams match. Just so you know, this dart is a bit smaller than the normal bust dart because this top is on the bias. Ooh, and they don't. So I'm just going to adjust the bottom dart leg here. Why the bottom dart leg? Well, if I brought the top dart leg out, the side seam would be really straight at the top, and I want it to curve in. See how the line looks really nice now? It looks like the shape of a body. And I'll just draw the dart folds at the side seam here, making sure they're the same shape as the side seam. So you need to check which way the dart on your top is folded first, so whether it folds up or down. And my pattern is done. All it needs now is the seam and hem allowances. But one point before I show you more complex darts, I chose to do the bottom half first because my bust to hem length was longer than my bust to neck measurement because my top has a V-neck. But if your top or dress has a higher neckline and a proper armhole, you can do that first. The important thing is that you have a large enough area that you can use to start your pattern off, and then you can rotate it at the dart. That was how to trace a relatively simple dart, and you can see it's a lot easier when you can get inside the garment and measure how wide the dart is. But what do you do if the dart is shaped, or if the seam allowance has been trimmed off, or there are lots of style lines? This is when the interfacing method is really handy. And I use the interfacing method for when designs are complex, so lots of style lines, or when I
I couldn't get a tracing wheel through a piece. So this jacket, it's got the woolen fabric, shoulder pads, lining. It'd be really hard to actually get a pin or tracing wheel through there. And also the shoulder pads kind of distorted a bit, so it wouldn't really be accurate. Plus it's also got dart here, pockets. So when the designs are complex, I use the interfacing method. This is how I do it. Okay, so this is how I do the interfacing method. And I like to do the interfacing method on a mannequin. Why? Because I use it for more contoured pieces. So these pieces that I can't get flat onto a table. Some people do interfacing method on a table, but I find if you're trying to do something contoured, if you've got it on a table, like a flat surface, you'll be pushing the contours out to lay the interfacing on top. So why not just put it on a body, and then the mannequin is actually pushing the fabric out in the place where it wants to be. Just makes it a lot easier. So I always use the interfacing method on a mannequin, and then I'll just draw my grain line somewhere. So once again, because interfacing is a fabric, you kind of want to treat it like a fabric. So you want to make sure it's on grain. So you look for a place that on the pattern that would be on grain. So I know this sort of edge of the lapel here will be on grain. But if you're doing something that you're not too sure, like the back here, you can either draw a grain line and then try and match it to a grain line on the fabric there. You have to sort of, like we did with the paper method, you have to sort of look for straight lines that'll be on grain or the center line so you can create your method tracing. So what I'll do is I'll just pin the grain line to the edge here. Then I might just put a pin here just to hold it in place. And then I'll just start smoothing it up. So get down here. And because it is a fabric and it's very delicate, you want to make sure that firstly what your piece of clothing isn't, that it's lying flat, and also the interfacing is lying flat. It's really easy for one of them to maybe be a bit warped, and if either one of them isn't completely flat when you put the pins in, it means your pattern isn't going to be correct. So you really want to be pushing it down, and so you just keep going up and up and up, keeping it smooth and taut. And like we did, because this jacket's got a dart in it, as well as some pockets. Like we did with the top, just try and make sure that you're getting the flat areas first. So don't start with the dart. Try and get the parameters of the piece first, and then we'll do the dart last, because that'll have some shaping. I'm not necessarily pinning at the seams here like I was with the other one. I'm pinning throughout. This just helps me keep it really flat. And you'll want to make sure when you do a jacket that you copy the break line. So you can't see it underneath here, but this is called the break line there. It's just a good reference to have on your pattern. So say if something does go a bit off, you know where that break line is, and that can help you reconstruct it. And remember, we always stop at the seams, even for interfacing. So there's the edge of that's where the lapel finishes and the collar starts. That's as far as I'll go. And see, it's getting a bit crumply here. So when you go around curves, often you'll need to snip into it. Same when you're doing draping. The important thing is you don't want to snip too far though, because obviously once you release that, you can't get it back together again. So before you start snipping into a corner to relieve tension in the fabric, make sure you've got the point right. And another great thing with interfacing is that you can sort of actually get your finger and just kind of get into the seams there. So not only can you draw them, you can actually sort of mark them with your finger, which is quite handy. So I'll mark the side seam and armhole as well, and I need to get my hand in here just to push that out a bit. So my style line for the jacket is in here, and you can see that I've actually got that little bit of excess there. So that would be my style line dart. This is why the interfacing is quite useful method. So I'd pin out that excess like I was if I was doing a dart and just mark it. So when I create my pattern, I'll obviously open that up and turn it into a dart. And I'll pin that all the way down. And the dart's quite small because it's quite a boxy, oversized jacket. And I'll mark it down to the pocket here. Because the pocket, it's kind of like a style line here. So I'll pin that all the way down. And I'm not going to increase the dart up to this point. So when I create my pattern, I'm actually going to close that dart. This will make sense when I show you how to make the pattern. But essentially, just pinning all this excess down. So once I'm happy with how the interfacing's looking, everything's looking good, I can grab a marker. I'm going to use a purple vanishing one because I don't want to damage my fabric, but however you want to mark. And I'll just draw around all my seams, the edges here. I'll mark any buttons. I'll mark this dart excess, armholes, side seams, and the hem, obviously.
Once I'm done, I'll remove the interfacing from the jacket and grab a piece of paper big enough for the entire pattern piece. The pattern needs to be on grain, so I'm drawing a line in the corner here, and I'll lay that first straight line I drew on the interfacing. Remember that line I drew before I even put the interfacing on the mannequin? I knew the edge of the lapel here was on grain, so I anchored my interfacing there and made sure the interfacing was on grain at that point too. But your grain line or center line could be somewhere else, so just wherever it is on your interfacing, try and find the same location on the paper so you can match it on top. Then I'll pin the interfacing to the paper. I'll start at the corner here and smooth out the interfacing till it's nice and flat, and then pin it in place. Then I'll use a tracing wheel to draw over my seams. Once you've traced all the lines, you can remove the interfacing and draw over all the lines with a pencil. Okay, I think my top section looks pretty good shape-wise. I'm going to focus on the darts in this demonstration, but I would check the armhole, shoulder and collar measurements against my jacket to make sure everything matches. And I've drawn the break line here, which is where the jacket lapel folds over. So I want to check my button and buttonhole positioning, the pocket length here and my dart. This lower section of the dart, I'm actually going to close it. I obviously couldn't just pin the top half of the dart on the interfacing and finish the pocket because it'd have a massive bit of fabric there. So I had to close it all the way down. But now I'm going to remove this on my pattern, which I'll show you how to do in a second. See how the dart finishes at the pocket and there isn't anything below? This is what my pattern should look like, and it will. Ooh, I actually forgot to mark this pocket detailing, but I can do it later. I'll just lay my pattern on top of the jacket and mark it. I also need to add the width of that pocket opening here, which I'll show you how to do too. Now let's check the buttonhole placement. So I'll measure the distance from the edge, which is 1.5 centimeters, and mark that distance on my pattern. Actually, my bottom buttonhole is looking more accurate than my top, so let's check the distance between them is correct, and it is. Then I'll measure the buttonhole length, which is 2.5 centimeters, and mark it on my pattern. Then I'll check my button placement. The button is in line with the buttonhole here, and it's 12.5 centimeters from the edge. So I'll mark the buttons with a large circle about the size of the button and draw a cross in the middle. The middle of the cross should be where the button will be sewn. Now I'm going to mark my center front. It's always good to mark the center front on your pattern. It's just a really good reference, especially when you've got lapels and buttons. And I know the center front is always in the middle of the two buttons, and the second button is here. So I'll just measure the distance from them, and it's 10.5 centimeters between them, and mark the center. Then I'll draw a perpendicular line along it, and this is my center line. Now I'm going to check the length of my hem. This will tell me whether I've closed the dart correctly at the bottom here. The hem of my jacket is 34.8 centimeters, and the total length of my pattern, including the section I need to close, is 37.8 centimeters. This means I need to close 4 centimeters at the bottom here. I'm just looking at my pattern now. I'm not sure exactly where to mark those points right now, so I'll just make a note to close it by 4 centimeters. Once I check the dart above, I'll be able to get a better idea. Now let's check the pocket length, and it's 14 centimeters. So let's check how long it is on the pattern. Ooh, and it's 15.5 centimeters. This means I need to take off 1.5 centimeters somewhere. So let's check the small section here is correct. Yes, this is 1.5 centimeters on my jacket and my pattern. So I'm going to take off 1.5 centimeters on the other side here. Now I'll check my dart length, which is 20 centimeters. And this is actually a fair bit higher than what I marked. So let's double check. Yep, if you look at my jacket, the dart finishes at about the underarm here. and when I extend on the pattern, it finishes at the same point. Now I'll connect the dart point with the base here, and I'll just put a drill hole in the center so I've got 2 points to match together when I'm sewing. And I'll put a drill hole at the top. Now let's mark the pocket and the cut line. When I copied the jacket, I actually traced the width of this little flap here, but I don't actually need this on my pattern. It's a separate piece. What I actually need is the cut line for the pocket here. So let's measure the distance, and it's 1 centimeter. Then I'll mark 1 centimeter away from the top line here on my pattern. The cut line should be in the center of this 1 centimeter seam allowance, and mine's a bit off, so I'll just rub it out and put it in the center. When you create your jacket, you would actually cut along this line here. Essentially, it's like a Y cut line, like on a shirt vent. So I need to add drill holes at all the key corners so I know where to snip to. I also need to add a drill hole at the base of the dart here so I can match those points to sew my dart. Actually, let me show you. So you cut along here, right up into the drill hole, then you stop and snip into the corners. This allows you to sew the dart and to insert the pocket bag and flaps. Now I need to close this section here so the bottom of the pocket is the same length as the top. The total dart width is 3.5 centimeters, but I need to close 4 centimeters at the bottom. So I'm just going to place my ruler at the end of the first dart leg and draw a straight-ish line to the hem. Then I'll mark a point 4 centimeters away at the hem and draw a line connecting that point with the end of the second dart leg. Then, to close this section, I'll fold the paper along the first line here and lie it on top of the other line. And that's the hard part done. My pattern is sitting nice and flat and it looks like my jacket, and the seam along the pockets all match up. Now I just need to add my seam allowances. Before the hem, I'll just measure the jacket, and it's 3 centimeters visible seam allowance, but it's sewn to lining, so I'll need an extra 1 centimeter seam allowance to attach it. So I'll draw a 4 centimeter seam allowance along the hem. So you can see this method does take longer, but if your design is complex, so a dress with style lines or a tailored jacket, you will get better, more accurate results using this method. But I would still check my work, so remember to measure the key seams, like dart lengths, pocket lengths if you're doing jackets, and make sure your pattern matches the clothing. So we've covered a lot in this video, and I haven't done pants, which was deliberate because I feel like pants are a whole thing in itself, and I kind of want to talk about pant fitting as well. So follow my channel. I've got a lot more pattern cutting videos coming up, and that one is in the pipeline. Also, if you're doing want to copy a drape design, you'll need to recreate it. You can't really trace drape designs. And the great news is that once you follow these 3 steps and turn your favorite piece of clothing into a perfect pattern, you can then either create a clone of it or you can start designing. So if you trace a dress, you could then change the length, add some style lines, change the neckline, or maybe add some drape sections. If you trace a shirt or a collar shirt, you could change the collar shape, adjust the sleeves to make them shorter, create a rolled cuff. You could also add style lines, bring the shoulder seam forward, add a yoke, add a box pleat. There are so many possibilities. And if you don't know how to do any of that, don't worry. I've actually written very detailed step-by-step guides designed for absolute beginners to teach you how to turn patterns into your own designs. So these guides are part of my do-it-yourself pattern cutting kits, which I made for absolute beginners to learn how to create their own patterns. Each kit has a block, which you use the base to create your pattern, and a guide which shows you how to change that block into any design based upon it. But you don't actually need the block anymore because you've made your favorite piece of clothing into a pattern. But you will find these guides useful, and they are very detailed. And the PDF version, I think about $18.50 Australian. So they go through everything step by step, and as I said, they are very detailed, like my videos. So take a look inside. The oversized shirt guide is broken down to 4 sections. The first section is Make a Plan, which helps you identify the changes you need to make to the block to turn to your pattern. And then part 2 will help you select the best pattern cutting method and give you step-by-step instructions on how to twirl your block. Part 3, Unleash Your Creativity, walks you through all the changes you can make to the block, such as adjusting the length, changing the button, placket and collar, lots of information on different collars, and then how to adjust the yoke and change the shoulder seam position, how to change all the different parts of the sleeve, including its silhouette, adding pleats, adding gathering, using an elastic band, creating different types of chest pockets and belts and epaulets and roll-up sleeve tabs. And actually this is quite cool, how to add trims. Then I'll show you how to finish your pattern, so select different hem allowances, and you can use the Find Your Finishes guide to select the best seam finishes. And there are some pro sewing tips at the end. And you can purchase the guide on my website, clickedpatternkits.com. The possibilities are endless, so grab your favorite piece of clothing, create a pattern following these steps,
test it, and then you can start designing.